Welcome. My first guest today is John Vickers. He's known locally as Mr. Festival, as well as being the Vice President of Amalgamation Yes. So thanks for coming in today, John.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate your time. So let's start with your festival hat, your festival involvement. So the International Buskers Festival and the Chalk Art Festival and the Kite Festival, they're all your creations.
Yes.
Okay. So why are these events so important to Victoria, the Greater Victoria
area?
Greater Victoria.
Well, I left my past career around 2009, 2010 in corporate life, and I decided one day I'd go to work for the community of Victoria. The city likes to remind me only in my own mind, but anyway, I always felt the downtown after Folk Fest was lacking in terms of fun and activity down in the Inner Harbor and downtown, and I didn't think one event could do it. I thought if I could bring 2 or 3 large international events, it would help bring that energy and what have you into the downtown core. So I looked around North America and I figured, why try to invent something new when you can look at events that have worked somewhere else? And in Halifax, I found the successful Buskers Festival, and then I flew down to Sarasota, Florida, and I found a very successful street painting festival, and then down to California where I saw a kite festival. So over the period of 3 or 4 years, I was able to arrange for the organization of some nonprofit societies. I'm the simultaneous executive director for each, and these events now are, as I say, very well received by the community.
They are, as far as I can tell, in terms of what I've seen and what I've participated in. So other than you, like what, are there hundreds behind you helping make these happen?
Well, each festival is a nonprofit society, so we're a BC incorporated society with a volunteer board of directors, and where I am the executive director responsible for executing the particular event for the society. And these events are funded federally. For example, the Buskers Festival is a regional Francophone celebration as well. The Chalk Art Festival is a celebration of our First Nations community, and the Kite Festival is an intercultural, multicultural celebration. And so through grants and as well as the provincial government is a strong supporter with the economic benefit of buskers. They step up to the plate each year. This past year they extended $25,000, for example, to the buskers. And
this was the federal government?
Provincial.
Or provincial
and the federal as well with those cultural celebrations. And then regional and provincial funding. It comes down to about 30 grant applications all winter and raising all your sponsorships and putting it all back together again for the next year. But it's really fun just to walk around downtown, or even for that matter out at Clover Point during the Kite Festival and see the impact of these events. I find it personally very rewarding, and it keeps you motivated when the skies are cloudy some days.
So when I read in the paper recently that the sky seemed to be a bit cloudy in terms of apparently the Downtown Victoria Business Association, the DVBA, will host its own Buskers Festival this summer, and it's going to partially overlap with your International Buskers Festival. So can the city handle 2?
I think the whole thing is quite ridiculous myself. I think at the end of the day, when you have a major attraction like the International Buskers Festival that has proven to be a winner from both the local community as well as a tourism attraction, it's unfortunate that what's happened is we received about 25% of our operating budget from the tourism community. And the tourism group downtown announced in early October that they would have a new strategy for the future where tourism would focus on accommodation or conferences and channel their dollars on festivals through the Downtown Victoria Business Association. And it's just unfortunate. In Buskers, as an example, it's been 5 years since we've had a full economic impact study. And my only issue is if they're going to judge the event, I feel like a protective parent. If they're going to judge the event and the impact of the event and the quality of the event in our community, it's unfortunate that it wouldn't at least be able to have the opportunity of another major impact study to show what it's capable today. I mean, 5 years ago, it was a $3 million economic benefit, and we're way larger today, and much like the chalk art. So I'm hoping through political and community effort that we can keep things on track and hopefully return for another great summer in downtown Victoria.
Well, the rationale that was put out there for doing it is there was some talk of a different business model, but the business model that you just outlined there in terms of, well, before you change models, why not do some analysis of the existing model to see what kind of, financial impact, it has on the city.
And it's very common, for example, at major busker events, which are out in Eastern Canada, these things occur on a fairly frequent basis where they'll come in and they are able to, they can't say every person stays in a hotel room or every person, spends this much money, but they're broad enough and specific enough that they can certainly extend a pretty good overall picture. And one of the things about international buskers is that it's 10 days and we operate for 90 hours. And when I go down to Ship Point and talk to some of the attraction group members and what have you, they say, John, you bring up the economic threshold by about 22%, and then you keep it there for 10 consecutive days. And that has a lot to do with the benefit, not to mention the fact that we distribute more theater to more Victorians than all of the indoor theater in the city combined in a year. And it just seems that when you're free and you're outdoors, sometimes it's like you become a strawberry tea. And there's sometimes not the sensitivity that you're a $300,000 nonprofit effort with no gate that is trying its best to, as I say, bring entertainment and fun and economic benefit to our downtown.
So the other thing that happened with respect to, again, taking some hits, if you will,
sure,
was the relocation of the Chalk Art Festival. And my understanding was that, you always had it on Government Street, and now you wanted to put some food trucks in because they certainly seem to be a real, important aspect of anything they're going to do like this.
Sure.
So the food trucks weren't allowed on Government Street, so you said, okay, we'll move it down to Ships Point. So in terms of, the degree of cooperation that you get from you bring these people into the downtown sector, and then you don't seem to be getting the degree of cooperation that one would expect if the benefits you're offering are as you've outlined them.
The Chalk Art Festival, when we first brought it out, it's had multiple locations. We've maintained the Government Street location, but they wouldn't let the food trucks in the first year. And so what we did was, the second year, we opened up at Centennial Square. So we had a Zone 2, but it was considered too far away. We put the food trucks over there, we put some chalk people over there, some painters, as well as Government Street. Then we also tried the Royal BC Museum one year where we did one of our 3D displays, but then on that particular issue, people felt it was, once again, too far removed. And then when they didn't allow the food trucks on the fourth year, I put them down on Langley Street, try to get them close, but it just, even though it's around the block through the center of Bastion Square there, it just wasn't close enough. So it hasn't been through a lack of effort to try, and I think a lot of the businesses down there are more open for change. It's very, very tough street to do anything community oriented. You have a certain guard down there that just sometimes thinks they have, we're on the street, we know the issues. Well, I've operated offices on both sides of the street. I happen to have my residence on the street further to the south. And as I say, it's coming, but unfortunately things soured in that when you put the history behind the event and the level of effort it takes to bring that festival to Victoria, it is indeed very frustrating that something as minor as a couple of food trucks could stand in the way. But when you have 60% of your audience going, it's the #1 issue the year before, where are the food trucks? It brings a sense of community to the event. And if I'm putting 15,000 people into a couple of blocks the restaurants don't have to worry.
About a couple
When I go around and talk to the people working the doors, they go, John, we love this event. So there is that disconnect. And again, I've always said, for change to occur, we need leadership from City Hall. And leadership on Government Street, as far as City Hall goes, has been vacant for at least a decade. It's been a decade, at least, since the city has even tiptoed down there to try to do anything. But I think the pressure continues to build, and I believe in the next year we're going to see a bit of a breakthrough and see actual change starting to occur.
So if I'm a very community-minded person and I have a great idea for an annual event, which will do much of what you're doing, and I'm willing to bust my butt for years to, establish it, make it become self-sustaining, what's your advice to me?
Well, I would say do your best to get as many on board before you start, because no matter how good it is, you can have something very successful where if minds aren't open to it, it can still hit a roadblock. And I think that's probably would be my most time-saving advice. But other than that, if you bring great art, no matter where you place it, the Buskers Festival, the Chalk Art Festival, they're 8-foot by 10-foot paintings. They really are awe-inspiring.
They're breathtaking.
They come from around the world. And the delivery of art to the masses is what I keep reminding the city of. They just, I always say in our playhouses this year, we spent $700,000 on the McPherson, we spent $700,000 on the Royal, and with greatest respect to those arts institutions. But here I host $150,000 out into the community, and my annual, on a $300,000 budget, and my annual $7,000 extension from the city of Victoria doesn't cover porta potties, just because of the number of people that come down to the waterfront. And we do get CRD funding, but we have fractured arts funding here. Only eight of our municipalities contribute to arts, and we have limitations in providing metro scale events for a city, a greater city, the size of 350,000 people.
One last issue around the festival hat that you wear is the city's right now looking at permanent structure to go into, apparently they're looking at a permanent structure to go into Ships Point. And Ships Point, where it's, a continuous number of pop-up structures that accommodate a particular event that lasts 10 days, they go down, another event moves in. So what are your concerns there in terms of a permanent versus...
I'm almost totally against the city doing anything right now, and I'll tell you why. First of all, Ships Point is a parking lot. It is first and foremost parking lot. That small lot behind the hot dog stand beside the Inner Harbor Pier is a busy parking lot, and it runs 24/7. The city does allow us the opportunity sometimes to use that lot, as you say, to set up for special events. However, the larger lot you can no longer use. The city terminated event use of the Harbor Air lot, so that lot you could never use. The other one is a very small lot that you can use on approval, and that's it, other than the pop-up area, which is this small courtyard of open pavement beside the Flying Otter. And when you look at the Buskers Festival, for example, I operate stage 2 there. I put more citizens onto that plot of pavement than 6 months of people that just happen to, to stroll through that zone. I'm all for pedestrian improvements. I'm all for if it's a temporary structure. But if you entrench something there, what do? I mean, I can't use the other lot. So you can't, the other lot is relatively small. So I just cringe. I think even there's, in some of the media stories, they'll show the small parking lot and they'll go, this is where the city's looking at doing stuff. No, the city's leaving the parking lots alone. All we're talking about is that one space. And hopefully, whatever they do won't negatively impact the Buskers, the Dragon Boat Festival. I mean, I can list all the festivals and events that could potentially be affected depending on what ultimately they decide to place there.
Okay, just a few minutes left here. Let us go over on your first hat. So put your second hat on here as the Amalgamation Yes Vice President. And So we had in the last municipal election, we had a variety of questions that were put out to about 85% of municipalities, asking them in different ways, indirectly, sometimes directly, as to whether or not they would want a study, just a study of amalgamation. And I don't know, he got a 75% rate
of 88% of the population who were within those eight municipalities.
And 75% of them said, yeah, we would like an in-depth study of amalgamation.
They basically asked 8 different questions. We came up with one question, and then we went to the CRD and we said, is there any chance that you could employ one question across the CRD so we could get a true assessment? Because we've already noted the media, I mean, Czech TV's had them at 70% in favor. I saw one for 75% in favor. You know, with the Angus Reid, we had 82% in favor of amalgamation, 88% of the region supporting an amalgamation study. I mean, these aren't just majority numbers; they're the vast swath of the population. So then we came down to having to go to the particular councils, and when we presented a generic question that we thought could suffice, each and every council was like, "Well, you don't expect us to use Esquimalt question," and Central Saanich would go, "Well, you don't expect us to use North Saanich's question." So we ended up with the 8 different questions, but we did get 75%. We did get 75% support, and the next day after that election, the front page, there was Community Minister Coralie Oakes saying, amalgamation study approved for the capital region. She was interviewed and said it would be complex. Oh, we know what's happened. She left the ministry, a new minister came in, and so we sit here today.
Well, the study that has emerged seems to be pretty stripped down. I think it's in the neighborhood of like $100,000.
It's about $80,000.
$80,000, and it's the minister Fassbender took great lengths to not use the A word, not use the amalgamation word. This was focused exclusively on looking at shared services. So what hopes do you have of anything coming out of that would maybe be a step in the right direction?
There could be areas under an amalgamation umbrella where integration and those types of efficiencies could fall underneath. But in the broader picture, I mean, the people voted for an amalgamation study. The minister is delivering something that we did not ask for. He's looking to entrench our 91 mayors and councillors, who 7%, according to Angus Reid, says makes any sense in our current municipal structure. We've seen time and time again, whether it was the sewage debacle, this idea that we'll just get some more grease, axle grease, and get along better as a 91-person happy family. I don't think anybody believes it. I don't think the bulk of the population believes it. What the population wants to see is a reduction in the level of municipal government. We have no position on the level of regional amalgamation. We wanted that in-depth study. And that $80,000, just to give you an idea, the typical amalgamation studies of a region of this size would probably be closer to $500,000 to $750,000 to $1 million. And when you see the regional review on integration is less than the current amalgamation study in Duncan and North Cowichan, which is a much more broader, in-depth review. So, as I say, we don't give this a lot of credit. He's not responding to the will of the population, and hopefully that'll change.
Hopefully it will. John, I really appreciate your time today.
It's really my pleasure.
Thanks for coming in.
Thank you. Thank you.
That concludes the first segment of the CRD in Context. My next guest today is Saanich Councillor Fred Haynes. Thanks for your time today, Councillor.
Thanks for inviting me, John. Pleased to be here.
So I know that you were only, I shouldn't say only, but you were an alternate director at the CRD, so you step in when somebody's absent.
That's correct. I'm Vic Derman's alternate. And Vic misses very few meetings, so it's a rarely used seat on my part.
Very rarely used, but you were there at a very pivotal moment. So I'd just like to jump in at that level, and then we can segue into your councillor responsibilities and some of the issues associated with that. But the one that caught my attention is that in mid-September, the CRD board decided to go with a centralized tertiary facility at McLaughlin Point. So is the 30 years of discussing it now over?
I think so, John. We're very clear that the CRD has agreed to move forward. The provincial funding moves us forward. And not only that, but the federal funding and the federal regulations move us forward. Work to take an alternative approach had an opportunity, but the leadership around that could not coalesce the required votes. So at the end of the day, 14-1, it moves forward.
So when the vote was taken, you were filling in for Director Dermott, as you say.
Yes, Councillor Dermott was on vacation in Europe at the time.
Right. So, but your vote was a reversal of your 2 years,
Very good,
against the centralized secondary facility at McLaughlin. So, was that a difficult decision for you to?
The actual decision on the day was not difficult. The process of getting there had some challenges. 2 years before, previous to the election, actually 4 years before and 3 years before, I was part of a community groundswell that was very concerned about the installation of biosolids and treatment at the Heartland facility. We were very concerned about that much money, $1 billion, being built to process at a secondary level. At the secondary level, some 85 to 90% of the contaminants we're trying to remove, because we're concerned about them, still go out in the waterborne effluent. The new approach is to bring tertiary level treatment. We're not exactly sure of what level of tertiary, but it is a much better proposal. Also, it's scaled down. It required to meet the approval of Esquimalt, which followed. So given that it met our objectives, the petition that we filed with the legislature, 2,200 from several groups, but particularly the Prospect Lake Community Association, for which I was the past president, was concerned about a needs cost-benefit analysis. Without the benefit of being able to remove those waterborne components, there seemed little point in spending the $1 billion. Once you put that piece in, the equation changes. Separately, we were quite clear from our feedback from federal government that they wanted to proceed, and the funding of $500 million was clearly at risk. One can argue whether the receiving environment in a marine condition enables us to reduce the federal risk level such that we could have an extension of the timeline. Many approaches to the federal government could not get that change in case. So basically, we made the vote that was the appropriate vote for the residents of the region and for the economy of the region.
When you mentioned that you're not quite sure what level of tertiary it's going to be,
yeah.
and obviously treatment at a tertiary level is one of the things that got you involved in the file way back in...
Plus the biosolids treatment and the end destination of the biosolids. Yeah.
So when will you know whether or not the level of tertiary is to your satisfaction?
The knowledgeable committee, we'll call it that, the committee of experts is bringing forward that report, and that will be defined shortly, we understand. Separately, one of my roles, not being on CRD, was to ensure that the Saanich community, the population of Saanich, have their day. And I put a motion through council which was supported, not unanimously, but it was supported, to ask the expert panel, once they have their ideas firmed up for both the tertiary level and how they're going to process the solids at Heartland, to come to Saanich Council such that Saanich residents and Saanich stakeholders can come and listen to what they say. It's a committee of the whole, which is the broadest possible opportunity for residents to speak to, and therefore get a better understanding. One of the things we ran into in the previous approach under CITIRA was not just some questions about the technology, but also the public engagement piece. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of concern that it was perhaps not so much public engagement as public telling. This way around, we hope to have a more effective public engagement.
So when the expert panel or the representatives, sort of report out to Saanich saying, here's the level of tertiary treatment that we're going to have, and the community isn't satisfied.
Let's cross that bridge when we get there, John.
Okay. But are there mechanisms in place? I mean, what I'm trying to get a handle on.
I'm not sure if there are mechanisms at this point to reverse the decision, but to get the social license they need, now they've got the political license, but to get the continued social license, they will have to come with a level of tertiary treatment, one imagines, that will satisfy these questions. Not only that, but they'll have to come with a level of treatment for the biosolids at Heartland that satisfies the concerns of the area around there about leachate into the watershed, the contamination of the air and soils, etc. We do see that the province is now looking at the opportunity for the agricultural spread of appropriately treated biosolids from sewage treatment. That was not on the table before. That alters the dynamic. We also see interest around gasification. Gasification is an interesting technology. The question is it fully economically viable at the large scale of mixed materials where you have a high moisture content, and gasification works best when the material has a standard dryness?
Yeah, I was following the gasification file, so again, that's something that's still outstanding. But in terms of the re-looking or possibly re-looking at the spreading of treated solids on, on the ground, on agricultural land, that sort of thing, my understanding was that that was off the table.
Correct.
And so if it's put back on the table, where are you going to be?
Well, we have to have a look at what is the nature of the final treatment of the biosolids. It is a practice that's been used worldwide in other locations. It's actually a practice that was started in the great city of London from England. Back in as far as the Roman days, the medieval days, the night soil was a big part of the fertilizer that fed London. Now, back then, we didn't have the trace pharmaceuticals, we didn't have the trace perhaps medical metals. So it really depends on what is the nature of the final bioproduct out of that treatment system that's going to be available for spreading.
So in terms of the how we got to be here today, a couple of things. One is the review that was done of what was on the table by the project board. It seemed to be a fairly, condensed period of time in which they were to review all of the work done to date, which goes back decades. So again, it's that question of, are you satisfied that enough, sufficient review was done of that earlier work?
In my own mind, yes, that's why I voted for it.
Okay.
I was a bit concerned at one time there was a mention of 50 truckloads of solids coming out of the treatment plant to be piped, to be trucked up to Heartland, and that's part of the argument for pipes. When we drill down into that a little bit and unpackage it, it's probably under 10 to 12 truckloads a day. So I thought that was a sort of a bit of a misstep in the pronunciation there. But in terms of looking at the technology, revising the fit into the Esquimalt location, I think that's moving forward. That said, we've just talked recently about climate change, rising sea levels. We have to be absolutely sure that the tsunami risk is fully understood and fully prepared for.
Okay, so I'm not asking you to, guess the future, but are there
Why
any...
not? That's why we're here, John.
That's why you're here. But are there any potential sort of game... I mean, like you say, the decision's been made. It's going to be a centralized facility at McLaughlin Point. And from this point forward, there seems to be some, as you say, room for adjustments in order to garner the social license that's required in order to, move it forward. But so are there any big potential game-changing developments
I think the
out
two
there?
pieces I'm looking for, and I think other colleagues would be looking for, is how effectively we can get better use of the integrated resource in terms for energy and or perhaps for an agricultural enhancement material. If we can use this to go onto agricultural lands, this may be a way of improving our agricultural productivity by taking our lower grade fields up to a higher grade field for local food production. We are aware with climate change and even our own local economy that the drive to get 25 by 25, 25% of our food locally grown by the year 25 is a challenge. The richer the soil, the better the product. One of the things I am also interested in is how we truck our kitchen and yard scraps over the Malahat, and then residents can buy it back by the bag after it's been composted. That's not necessarily a long-term sustainable position. If we're able to perhaps integrate our kitchen and yard scraps with biosolids in a way that gives us soil amendment, in a way that does not disrupt through smell and other issues, then this is a sustainability piece that would be important in the future.
Okay, thanks for indulging me on the sewage file. Let's move
My
on to
pleasure.
your councillor
My pleasure.
file. So regarding September's Union of BC Municipalities, it's an annual
yes.
event took place in Victoria this year. You were there, you were on a couple of panels, and you were gratified that 4 resolutions that were put forward by Saanich Council were adopted by all of the other mayors and councils from across the province.
Correct.
So why is their support so necessary, so important?
Okay, for those who read the Times columnist article by Trevor Hancock just recently, he said it very eloquently that whilst municipalities are concerned with the pipes in the streets, we do need to look to our higher level of governments, the province and the federal government, to ensure that we're on track with the things we're trying to achieve for our communities. If one person speaks, that's one voice. But if a whole union of British Columbia municipalities speak, all the mayors and the assembled councillors from BC, this is a much more powerful voice. So that's the role that plays. Also, the resolutions from UBCM go on to the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. That's where all the mayors and all the councillors of Canada speak to the federal government. So if we have a pressing thing, for example, locally, we're concerned about housing and affordable housing. Across my desk of the Planning, Transportation and Economic Development Committee, we've put 9 reports through council. They've been fully supported, most of them unanimous. 5 of them have gone on to the Capital Regional District. 4 of those were unanimous, 1 had 1 vote against it. These are all about housing, co-op housing, seniors aging in place, enabled by renovation tax credits. If a municipality speaks individually to a minister, that's one level of story. If the UBCM speaks, then they know they've got a situation on their hands that deserves their attention. We can see that the province is concerned about housing. They've just put up $500 million on top of the previous $850 million. I'm sure that's partly in response to the call from the mayors and councillors across BC saying we need help with housing. Specifically at the most recent UBCM, we had a resolution on student housing. This was very interesting because it wasn't just municipalities, it was the entire student body of BC through the Association of BC Students and UVic students and other students. So something like 250,000 students spoke with one voice saying we need student housing addressed. But the point about student housing is this: student housing houses everyone, because if we have 38,000 students coming into the region and they're taking up rental accommodation, that means there's less workplace rental accommodation. It means there's less family rental accommodation. So yes, it's a big issue, and the UBCM is a fantastic voice to have been able to harness, and I'm delighted we could do that.
Yeah, it's a very successful shout out to the senior levels of government on this particular issue. The other one that came up was, in terms, still connected to the housing crisis, is to allow homeowners and
Short-term rentals.
What's that?
Short-term rentals.
No, I was
that where we're
thinking
going?
one that caught my attention because I was involved in it about 15 years ago in Victoria, and it was the allowing of, it was secondary suites then, but now it's to allow
Detached secondary suites?
No, it was
I'll let you
secondary
get there.
suites, but that was a huge issue, right?
Yes,
it was absolutely a huge change. Now that seems to have made its way out there into other municipalities, but now the newest one is to build independent secondary suites in the
Correct.
form of garden suites.
Yeah, garden suites, detached secondary suites or
Detached
detached accessory buildings.
Right.
These are very interesting. If you already own the land and you have a large garden, what's the problem, some say, of putting a little detached suite there? Some call them cottage houses, laneway houses, garden suites. Some of these are actually mobile and you can bring and drop them in on a base. But we have a lot of houses in Saanich that were built in the 60s and 70s. They're very large.
Big lots.
Big lot homes. They could accommodate either a retrofitted garage or workshop or a purpose-built detached suite. Once that happens, the homeowner could downsize into their own suite and rent out their house, if that was appropriate, or they could rent out the suite. Or some people that are looking to get medical attention and need to do some medical retrofitting of the house, it's actually easier to retrofit a smaller purpose-built detached secondary suite instead of running an escalator up the stairs, putting new medical equipment upstairs, rebuilding the shower. It's easier to build that out in a 400 to 900 square foot detached suite, single story, that is suitable to the neighborhood. So there's a medical thing there to allow seniors to age gracefully in place. The question is, John, what we're not sure yet is which neighbourhoods are going to be for it and which ones are going to struggle with it. We know that it won't be in rural Saanich, it won't be in Blenkinsop Valley, it will not be in the Broadmead area because they have restrictions. So where in Saanich is this appropriate? We have some community associations already contacting us saying they've got concerns, some saying, hey, we're very interested. We saw in Victoria that although they brought the same or similar proposal forward several years ago, the uptake was very restricted. The question is why? Why? Well, it had to be a rezoning before a detached suite was enabled, and that is a very restrictive process to go forward. So Victoria are looking at doing it at a staff level decision.
Yeah, even in the, again, going back 15 years to the introduction of basement secondary suites.
Yes.
That weren't standalone. There was a huge, I shouldn't say huge, there was,
It was a huge debate.
It was a huge debate, and around issues such as parking, traffic problems. The big thing that Victoria did was to remove the requirement for off-site parking for a secondary suite and allow the renter to park on the street. So what do you got planned for addressing these sorts of concerns?
There are a couple of things there. I think the secondary suites are most appropriate near our existing corridors and centres, such that there's already buses and other amenities nearby. You can walk to the shops, walk to coffee, etc., walk to coffee houses. But one of the ideas would be that parking would be on the property itself. There is a big concern in some of the areas about overwhelming on-street parking, particularly from employers in the area. Some of the hospitals, the universities, some of the larger companies, rather than pay the fee to park on the hospital, they'll park on the city street. That adds congestion that distresses some of the neighbourhoods. So if we were to add more parking there for the secondary suites, that's an issue.
Yeah, it would be. We're just running out of time here, so I'm going to thank you for your time today,
John.
and I really appreciate you coming in today.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it.
Okay. That concludes this segment of the CRD in Context. My final guest today is CRD Director and Victoria Councillor Ben Izzett. So thank you very much for your time today.
Hi, John.
Appreciate you coming in.
Oh, happy to.
Okay, so part of preparing for any guest is putting their name into the Times Colonist search, right? And pushing the button. And I got more hits for you in the shortest period of time than I think any other elected official that I've put in there. So why is that?
Well, I guess as the capital city, Victoria does get more coverage than some of the smaller municipalities.
No, but it's you specifically. Your name comes up.
I guess I'm quite outspoken. I think if you did an actual count, Mayor Helps might be up there as well.
Okay.
But certainly I think I've taken stances on a number of issues. Everything from bread and butter issues, like last week it was the police budget, calling for restraint in that expenditure, to advocacy around housing policy, a number of environmental policies. And also working at both the City Council and also the CRD board level. So I guess working around the whole range of issues, dozens of issues crossing my desk every week. I guess some of my comments are newsworthy.
Well, I mean, do you see that as part of your job? Would you like to see more of your colleagues be, again, out there and talking to the press and having a presence? Should they be doing more of that like you do?
Well, I think it's a part of accountability when you're an elected official, but it's sort of, I think, ancillary. Or it's, I think if you're working hard in the trenches and contributing in the community and pushing a lot of files forward, that's, I think, what the media maybe is picking up on. So it's not about, I think, trying to attract media attention. That can be somewhat hollow or certainly self-serving. So it's more, I think, if you're an active council member, an active elected official, then hopefully the media will pick up on that. But I think a number of my colleagues contribute in different ways, and I think it's the results. I think I would hope that the public would judge us based on the results and the outcomes, not just on the hot air that we might spout off in council meetings that the media might pick up on.
Well, one that most recently, I guess, that garnered some some press was in your role as the CRD on the CRD Parks Committee. So Island View Beach, I think maybe the most visited beach in the region, came up with a new management plan. And you had some concerns that it wasn't a balanced approach with respect to the various stakeholders. You got dog walkers, horse riders, walkers, picnickers. So how do you get a balanced approach when you've got
That's a
those?
good question. Yeah, and that's an interesting file. It's an interesting file, and it's a frustrating one. There's at least 4 different interest groups, probably more, and the CRD Park staff and the committee and the board have been trying to reconcile those interests, and we're still not there. Originally, a lot of the tension had to do with issues around mosquitoes and standing water on the property. Traditionally, so before it was a farm, before it went to the CRD, it was kind of a coastal sand dune. And so there was sort of a flushing action where the winter storms would come in, they would recede, and for portions of the year there was standing water, and that attracted mosquitoes and other bugs. But when, I guess, creeping residential housing in central Saanich, when that came about right up to what's now the park boundary, those kinds of uses were somewhat incompatible. So residents wanting quiet enjoyment and peaceful enjoyment of their property, and then this big parcel of land that the CRD acquired, and then all this standing water. And so when I first got on the Parks Committee 5 years ago, that was the major sort of advocacy effort. The Friends of Island View Beach, primarily led by residents who live very close to the beach, calling for the CRD to maintain the ditches, to ensure adequate drainage, to control the mosquito population. And then also some debates around the diking system and other kind of hydrology questions for the property. So we kind of muddled through that, and there was an interim sort of board policy that we would maintain the ditches. There's still a question mark. What would happen if there was a major storm that wiped out a dike? Would we rebuild it? Is that a proper parks expenditure? I think that's still a valid question. And then as all that was going on, this parks master planning or parks management plan process unfolded, and that's when we started hearing from thousands of Greater Victoria residents who really value that park for dog walking. And so it's probably the most well used for dog walking, potentially along with the Dallas Road Park, which is a City of Victoria municipal park. But out of the CRD parks, I'm fairly certain it has the highest usage by dog owners. But then when we started digging into that issue and dog owners wanting to retain sort of free access to the park and the trail system, we heard from environmentalists who expressed concern about dogs impacting the birds and some other wildlife species, also tracking around different invasive plants. And when we started looking into that, we started hearing from the First Nations, particularly the Sayote First Nation, which shares the northern border with the park. And they expressed concern about the impact on the natural plant species. Particularly, there's a number of medicinal plants that the Sayote people and the Wasanich people have been stewarding and harvesting for thousands of years. And so that's kind of where we're at now, a little bit of an impasse, you could say, over these different interests between the nearby residents and the mosquitoes, and they also value the park for recreation, the dog walkers. There's also people who want to ride their horses in the park. There's that environmental viewpoint, what about the plants and the animals? And then there's the First Nations interest right up against the park. There's also people who, with RVs and even people with tiny homes who want to set them up in the park and convert the campground for that purpose. There was one issue we did deal with which had to do with the boat launch, and so we have worked out an arrangement with Central Saanich for that one. So that's just an example of what we have to balance, both in the park system but also on other regional issues.
How do you differentiate between a potentially small but very articulate and very well organized and very vocal stakeholder group compared to a less articulate, not as well organized, but much larger?
Yeah, well, and that's a good point. And then even to make it a bit more complicated, what about when there is actually no stakeholder group speaking up? Let's say for whatever reason the environmentalists were all busy fighting pipelines that the federal government seems heck bent on approving. Let's say the Sayot First Nation was swamped just managing their own health and education system and looking after the needs of their residents.
So they had no spokespersons.
But although they are actually advocating, but I'm throwing out a bit of a hypothetical. Would me as an individual parks director, would I want to speak up for the plants and the ecology in the face of hundreds or even thousands of people more concerned about mosquitoes and more concerned about horses and more concerned about dogs? So that's a roundabout way of saying I don't think it's about numbers. It's important we always listen to what the public says and that we take those views into consideration in making decisions. But ultimately, it's about looking at the values, I think, behind those comments and trying to figure out what values should inform the decisions. For me, when I look at our regional park system, I think ecology and looking after sort of those environmental values needs to be front and center. And then we have to plan for recreational uses that I think are compatible with those environmental considerations. But there's always trade-offs and different. It's certainly challenging making these kinds of decisions. And next month, when the board decides this, who knows whether it'll get sent back for further work, further engagement, whether the plan as is will be approved with a portion of the public and a portion of the board not feeling it supportable. And that's, I guess, just a part of our democracy.
That's how it works. So one of the, obviously homelessness is a big issue in Victoria, in the region. So one of the quotes that I pulled out was, my view is that temporary sheltering areas like tent cities, as they're called, are preferable to unregulated sheltering in parks, alleyways, and other public and private spaces in our city. And then you advocated on behalf of a much, better tent city in Topaz Park. One of the concerns expressed was that if you take that approach, then you're going to institutionalize well-regulated tent cities, and nothing else will be done on that file since things have been taken care of. Did the notion of sort of the concern about institutionalization figure in your thinking when you were advocating for Topaz Park? Yeah,
so it certainly did, and where that discussion came out of, we've moved really far as a city and a region in the last year and a half.
Oh, big time.
And where we were at that point is we were hearing from our staff that there was prevalent sheltering occurring in about a half dozen city parks, where you would have 6 or 8 or 10 or a dozen people every night sheltering. And essentially we had a half dozen de facto tent cities scattered throughout our municipal park system. And it wasn't really serving anyone very well. There wasn't access to drinking water. There wasn't access to proper washrooms. There wasn't adequate supervision in terms of people providing support services, but also security, both for the people sheltering there, but also for people living near these parks. And the way our bylaw was worded, the compromise sort of with the courts, after the court said that people have a right to shelter themselves in the park system if there is an adequate alternate shelter, the compromise is that people could shelter themselves in the parks from 7 p.m. till 7 a.m., but then they had to be moved along. So every morning outside of these parks, you'd have this cat and mouse game where bylaw officers, police, park staff would shuffle the homeless along, they'd lug all their belongings, and you'd have this daily ritual of shopping carts and people migrating from the parks to the shelters and to the soup kitchens and to other gathering places that provide services downtown, and then back into the parks. That was expending a huge amount of calories for people who are very malnourished. It was perceived as being unsightly by the wider public, and it was extremely inefficient and also having an impact on the parks.
And not the best allocation of resources.
Certainly not. And so where the discussion went is, we want the province to act, and our original proposal was that we recommit to a housing first approach. We could quadruple the city's expenditure on housing to $1 million a year. We direct our staff to look at interim housing options, including acquiring old buildings, retrofitting them for housing. And then the fourth provision is, and we look at a temporary sheltering area in one or more parks. The staff came back and they said, we're proposing that we engage the public on the idea of Topaz Park, There were some others that were talked about, but they weren't really viewed as a preferred location. And so council voted to proceed with that engagement and asked the staff to develop a business case, tell us what the public said, and come back with a proposal. Well, as soon as that preliminary decision happened, we heard very clearly from the public that they valued Topaz Park for recreational purposes. They didn't want to see it used as a sheltering area, even though there were people sheltering there. And they said, if you're going to spend money on anything, spend it on housing. So out of that, I developed the proposal with the mayor and with Councillor Jeremy Loveday for the Regional Housing First program. And it said, basically, if you don't want us needing to make these makeshift sheltering areas and parks, if you want us to invest in proper housing, then let's do some borrowing regionally, call on the province to match it, and actually build proper homes. And miraculously, that's what we've managed to do. And with the CRD board agreeing to put forward $30 million subject to provincial matching, there's now $60 million in place, and the first request for proposals has gone out to build the first series of units. And ultimately we'll have, I believe, 800 units across the housing spectrum. And since all that happened, the homeless on their own initiative went and established the sheltering area at the courthouse.
Which was a brilliant, which seemed to me from the outside looking in, which was a fairly brilliant move because it wasn't on municipal land, it was on provincial land.
From a legal standpoint, the sheriff, who has responsibility for the courthouse, my read is that he did actually have the authority from the outset to prevent sheltering there, and I guess a decision was made not to. Once the camp was entrenched, it was viewed that it would take a court injunction to displace the campers, and we saw that process unfold where the judge said you can't just displace them back into the park system, and that provided the impetus for the province to purchase buildings, create 300 units of new housing.
Like that.
Like that. And the 60 million for the Regional Housing First is actually a separate stream. So we've actually seen the biggest investment in housing for the homeless in a generation. And we're now closer than we've been to substantially reducing or even eliminating homeless than we've been in a generation. And so it's been some hard discussions. Certainly there's been impacts on the people sheltering outdoors and on the people living next to these sheltering sites. But I think we're now well positioned to provide people with proper homes rather than having to rely on our park system for that.
Yeah, I was again. I was really quite struck by the torrent of supportive housing that was unleashed, by Minister Coleman in response. It seemed to having the courthouse taken over, if you will.
Well, the judge said the only way I'm giving you an injunction is if you have somewhere for these people to be sheltered. He says I won't give you an injunction. That's just going to push them into the parks.
Right.
The condition of me giving you an injunction is that there is a unit for them to move into. And the province carried through on that commitment, and they made sure there was a unit for every person who wanted one who was sheltering at the courthouse.
So I just have a bit of time left here, but one topic I wanted to touch on was one that seems to have been put to bed to a certain degree, and that's of wastewater treatment.
Yes.
So do you see in the future any I guess a couple of questions. One, are you satisfied with the level of analysis that was done by the project board? They come in, they weren't in for a very long period of time, and they supposedly looked at all of the work that had been done to date. So are you comfortable with that level of analysis and research?
For the whole front end of the system, I am. I think having the tertiary treatment at McLaughlin makes sense. The CRD owns the land. It was zoned for wastewater treatment. It has the biggest buffer to residential properties. And it fits with our conveyancing system. As much as we'd like, I think, a more distributed model, the fact is we have a very centralized conveyancing system of all the municipal sewers essentially flowing to Tidewater. And so I think for the front-end dewatering plant, I'm happy with the proposal. I think the biosolids component is completely up in the air, and the project board admits that. And I would have almost preferred to have the project board come forward and say, look, this is what we think you should do for biosolids. It's going to mean the budget has to increase by this amount, and then the board could consider that, instead of leaving this sort of question mark hanging over the back end of the process. And I think there's problems with the biosolids, both in terms of the unanswered question of what technology, what is the end use, and also the question of operations, which unfortunately is no longer a question. We're entering into a very costly and risky public-private partnership. Unfortunately, the CRD board chose not to push back and ask the federal government if they would stand up to their commitment, which they had made around the time of the election, that they wouldn't force local governments to enter into costly P3s. And rather than ask that question, the board decided to essentially approve the project board's recommendations as is. So I'm not happy with the biosolids part, but I am happy to see we're moving forward to stop polluting the ocean, to get some infrastructure in place, and hopefully incrementally we can address those outstanding problems.
Okay. I wish we had more time, but we don't. Councillor, is it?
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so
Thank
much
you.
for coming in. That concludes the CRD in context.